Welcome to episode 162 of Stage Worthy. I'm your host, Phil Rickaby. I'm just sitting here by the Netflix fireplace with a little mug of hot cocoa, just reflecting on the year that was. And I'm thinking a little bit about some of the shows that I've seen and some of the great people that have been on the podcast. And I wanted to talk for a little bit about that. So there's not going to be an interview this week, just a very quiet week. But if you're waking up on Christmas morning and you happen to look for a podcast, or maybe you're looking for a break from family, I don't know, you'll hear this and we can have a little chat about the year that was. This was a bit of an interesting year for me. Moved recently, so I'm finally settled into that place, so that's good. But in terms of my own professional life, I took the commandment out east, if you recall, and had some success out there. Although I'm not going to lie, not all of the East Fringe was a great experience. St. John was a wonderfully organized fringe, and I didn't have as good a time or experience in Halifax due to what I perceived as some organizational issues there. And maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe the Halifax as a fringe just isn't interested in out-of-towners. That was, again, my perception, or maybe it's just that maybe we weren't giving them what they wanted. So that's a possibility too. But generally, I learned an important lesson, and that was that I can take my show to another city by myself and I can make a go of it, which is something that I hadn't done before. I had performed the commandment in Hamilton previously, but I didn't do that alone. My director was with me at the time, and so this was a new experience, the experience of taking a show completely by myself to try to make a go of it. And I learned that I could do that. And challenges to look at for the future for more touring of the show, especially to fringe festivals, is to maybe swallow my introverted self a bit and get out and do a little bit more promotion, which is always a challenge because I am very much an introvert, which makes getting out and talking to people and walking up to people, especially strangers, but in general, people, to talk about myself and my show, that's always a challenge. But it is something that if I want to do this, especially at fringe festivals, it is something that I'll have to overcome. Some things to note when I'm looking at episodes from this past year of shows and people that were particularly successful. The Toronto Fringe Roundup, I found a lot of people seem to be interested in. A couple of people who weren't able to be in town really commented on being able to feel like they were part of the Fringe, even though they couldn't be here. But looking at my stats for the year and looking at the most popular episodes, interestingly, two of the most recent ones, the conversation with Sue Edworthy and the conversation with Adriana Prosser, where we talked about promotion of theater. Those were actually two of the most popular shows of the year. I think there's a real hunger from producers, especially indie producers, but in general, for talking about how to promote a show and how to connect with an audience. So I think that's a big part of that. So that's a really interesting thing to note, is that's really the most popular episodes of the year actually were these last two, especially when you look at the fact that, yes, people will listen as time goes on. So some of the episodes looking back are still getting listens today, but they're far fewer. These two had the most listens right out of the gate. So there's a real hunger for that. And I'm trying to think how we can build on that, because I think since there is a hunger for learning about and hearing about strategy and how to promote shows, that it's something that we should really be talking about more, because obviously people really need that. In terms of theater scene this year, I really have to say that I was very happy. Like this fall, I haven't seen a fall as amazing as this one. I do not envy the Dora jurors in Toronto for choosing shows, because there was just so much good this year. Two shows that I do really want to say that really impacted me were Factory's The Men in White, which just floored me, because it was a comedy until it wasn't, and just destroyed me at the end. So I hope that's not a spoiler if you ever get to see it. I mean, it's closed now at the Factory, but if you ever get to see it, I hope I haven't ruined that there's an emotional thing that happens at the end. But man, I didn't see it coming. My guest who came with me didn't see it coming, and it was really affecting. And the other show, Eldritch Theater's Space Opera Zero, there is really something magical about taking science fiction and trying to do that on stage. I think there's not a lot of genre that happens in theater these days, and I think that's really too bad. I'd like to see more genre on stage, just because it forces you to be more creative with what you're doing. I mean, you are not going to be able to do what they do in a movie, so how can you tell a sci-fi story on stage? How can you tell a horror story on stage? So these are super, super interesting things. And Space Opera Zero, because of its setting as sort of like the 1930s, 40s serial type movie, really was able to parlay that into some really magical stuff. And so, although there's puppets and there was models that looked, you could see the wires and all that sort of stuff like you would in one of those old movies. There was something really magical about it, which sort of proved to me that the genre can work. You just have to be super creative about it. And so this coming year, I'm looking to sort of grow the podcast a little more. It's still no advertising, and that's one thing that I'm not necessarily committed to, but I mean, we have to admit that doing a podcast about theater is a pretty niche audience. So I'm able to bring this podcast to you without having to rely on sponsors, and that's just a luxury that I have right now. It's a privilege to be able to talk to people. Doing a podcast does cost some money. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but it does cost some money. If you've enjoyed the podcast, I would really ask that you consider sharing it, going to Apple Podcasts, Google Music, wherever you get it, and leaving a comment or rating. That's the sort of stuff that can really help to grow the podcast. And so if you'd be so kind as to do that, I'd really appreciate it. And also just tell your friends about it if you have friends who you think might like the podcast. If you listen regularly, I hope that you'll share it around. And that's just because referrals are a great way to share podcasts. And I would like to see the podcast grow a little bit more, and then maybe eventually I could offset the cost of doing the podcast by having a couple of advertisers. I will never go overboard, though. Don't worry about that. And I will never charge you for this podcast. I'm committed to offering it to you free, because that's what podcasts are. They should be free. And so that's what I'm going to continue to do. If you've had a favorite episode this year, if you have a favorite episode that you've listened to, I'd love to hear which one it was. So let me know. Stageworthy is on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at StageworthyPod. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby, so you can find them both there. And I would really love to hear what your favorite episodes of the season were, so let me know there. I really hope that you've had a great year, and that the year to come is full of joy and love and laughter and good theater. This has been a Homebody Productions production.